During the horrors of war, there are stories that remain etched in our memories forever. One of them happened next to a soldier, in a moment of silence in the chaos. He held his revolver firmly and, looking at me, said something that chilled me. "I have the last bullet in my revolver. It's not for the enemy." That sentence carried a weight that ordinary words cannot express. And today, we are going to tell 32 shocking photos of the war that will make your hair stand on end. See the war in a different way that will make you cry without stopping. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and come discover this impressive story. The Last Bullet 1944. A soldier next to me told me that he had the last bullet in his revolver. He said, "It's not for the enemy." The gaze of a child in the rubble 1941. I was there, standing in the rubble of a street that had been bombed the night before. The smell of smoke was still in the air, and then I saw her. A little girl, sitting amid the rubble, with eyes so wide and frightened that they seemed to pierce my soul. She wasn't crying. She just stared straight ahead, holding a doll that had survived the attack, just like her. I asked her where her parents were, but she just shook her head. That scene left a lasting impression on me. The soldier with the letter in his hands, 1943. I was taking shelter in a trench in France when I saw it. A young soldier was holding a letter in his hands, as if it were something sacred. He read it over and over, and tears were streaming down his dirt-stained face. I couldn't help but ask what was so special about that letter. He showed it to me. It was his mother's words, telling him to come back alive, that she would be waiting for him with a warm cake on the table. He smiled as he showed me the letter, but even so, I could see the fear in his eyes. Nurses on the battlefield 1942. We were in a muddy field, and the war seemed like an endless storm. It was then that I saw the nurses. Dressed in worn-out uniforms and covered in mud, they were carrying wounded soldiers on makeshift stretchers. One of them, Clara, approached me. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm. "Let's get you out of here, okay?" she said. At that moment, it wasn't the horror of war that struck me, but the strength and courage of this woman who seemed to face death every day without hesitation. The farewell embrace, 1941. I was at the train station when I noticed the couple. The woman was hugging her husband so tightly that it seemed she was trying to hold him forever. She was whispering something in his ear, while he just held her in silence. When the train whistle blew, he finally let go. His eyes were full of tears, but he kept his head high as he got into the carriage. I stood there, watching the train leave, and I never forgot that farewell. Resistance in the Mountains, 1944. I climbed the mountains to meet a group of resistance fighters. They were armed with old rifles and wearing torn clothes, but their eyes held a determination I had never seen before. As they posed for a photo, one of them said to me, "We fight for our children. If we don't, who will?" They were few against many, but the force of their words showed that numbers were not what defined this war. The March of the Prisoners, 1945. It was snowing when I saw the endless line of prisoners crossing the camp. A thin man stumbled and fell, but another, younger man, helped him up. "Come on, you have to keep going," he said, his voice barely audible. That scene of solidarity in the midst of so much pain was one of the most powerful moments I witnessed in the war. The flag over Berlin, 1945. I was there when the soldiers climbed to the top of the Reichstag. They were shivering with cold, exhaustion, and emotion. When they finally raised the flag, we all cheered. It was the symbol of a victory that had been costly. I looked into the eyes of one of the soldiers and saw tears, but they were not tears of joy. He was thinking of the friends who had not made it to that moment. The last meal, 1944. That night, I sat with 4 soldiers around a makeshift campfire. They shared a can of beans as if it were a feast. They laughed, told jokes, and talked about what they would do when the war was over. I knew that the next day they would face a dangerous attack, but that night, for a few hours, they were just young men full of dreams. The empty stare of a prisoner 1943. I entered a concentration camp and saw a thin man with hollow, empty eyes. He looked straight at me without saying a word. There was no need. His silence told a story of suffering that I could never have imagined. The Smiling Aviators, 1942. I went to the airfield to register the pilots before they took off. They were smiling, joking with each other, but I knew that smile was a mask. When the first plane took off, silence fell. Each of them knew that it could be the last time they would be together. The Faithful Dog, 1942. A dog sat beside a destroyed trench, barking incessantly. He wouldn't budge. When I got closer, I saw why. Next to him lay the body of a soldier. The dog growled at anyone who came near, as if he were protecting his master to the end. I've never forgotten that loyalty. The Shared Soup, 1944. In the middle of a muddy field, I saw a group of refugees sharing a pot of soup. What struck me was not the scene itself, but the generosity of a woman who gave the last spoonful of soup to the man next to her, despite being visibly hungry. The Improvised Doctor, 1943. I met a doctor trying to save the life of a soldier with few resources. He used telephone wires as sutures and torn cloth as bandages. When I asked him how he managed to keep going, he replied, "Every life saved is a victory against this war." The Messenger's Bicycle, 1942. During an ambush, we hid behind trees while waiting for reinforcements. It was then that we saw a young man on a bicycle crossing the open field. He was carrying a bag full of messages. He took a risk for those papers, and we never knew if he reached his destination. The Ring in the Trench, 1943. While we were digging for cover, a soldier found a gold ring buried in the mud. He looked at me and said, "Someone must have lost it before all this started. They didn't know what was coming." The Broken Piano, 1944. Inside a destroyed house, I saw a piano with its keys ripped out. Yet someone was sitting next to it, trying to play something with his fingers in the air, as if he could still hear the music. The Last Train, 1944. I arrived at the station minutes after a train had left. It was a prisoner transport train. The sound of the iron wheels still echoed in the air. I could do nothing but watch the emptiness that was left behind. The Unexpected Embrace, 1943. In a refugee camp, a woman ran up to me and hugged me tightly. "You look like my son," she said, tears in her eyes. I didn't know how to respond, so I just hugged her back. Sometimes, small gestures were all that was left. The Caged Bird, 1944. In the middle of a bombed-out house, I found a cage with a canary still alive. It was trembling, but it sang softly. I couldn't take much with me, but I carried that cage for miles. Somehow, that bird was the last spark of hope for me. The Stopped Clock, 1941. I passed a destroyed train station and saw a large clock on the wall, stopped at 3:15. That was the time the bombing had started. That image remained etched in my mind as a mark of the moment when time stood still for that city. The boots in the mud, 1942. As we advanced through a trench, I tripped over something. They were abandoned military boots with the laces still tied. I looked around, but there was no sign of the wearer. It was as if the owner had disappeared, taken by the war. The letter in the mud, 1943. I found a letter on the ground, already stained with mud and blood. It was written in a language I didn't understand, but the words "my love" were clear. That piece of paper was a lost connection, a piece of humanity amidst the desolation. The flag on the ground, 1945. As I walked through the rubble of a square in Berlin, I saw a torn flag lying on the ground. It was covered in mud and blood, but I could still make out its colors. The flag was not just a symbol, it was a reminder of how many lives had been lost for that piece of cloth. The forgotten bicycle, 1941. I was walking down a devastated street when I saw a bicycle lying next to a partially destroyed wall. It was a child's bike, painted red, with a bent handlebar and a broken chain. I stood there, imagining the child who must have fled in such a hurry. Her absence spoke louder than any explosion I had ever heard. The Dance in the Rain, 1941. After a day of bombing, I saw two soldiers dancing in the rain to the sound of a harmonica played by a third. It wasn't a perfect dance, but it was a moment of humanity amidst the horror. The Escape over the Bridge, 1944. I was helping civilians cross a bridge under bombardment when I saw a mother carrying two children in her arms. Each step seemed like an ordeal, but she didn't stop. When she finally reached the other side, she collapsed on the ground, crying. The Rose in the Field, 1944. In the middle of a devastated field, I saw a single rose growing among the rubble. It was such an unlikely sight that it made me stop and think. Nature still had the courage to flourish amidst destruction. The Hidden Radio, 1943. In an occupied village, we discovered a radio hidden under floorboards. The villagers used it to listen to secret news. It was more than a radio. It was a symbol of silent resistance. The Bloody Handkerchief, 1942. Beside a road, I found a white handkerchief stained with blood. It seemed to have been used as a makeshift surrender flag, but it didn't work. The silence around was overwhelming. The Ownerless Helmet, 1944. In a forest, I saw a German helmet hanging from a branch. There was no one around, but it seemed to be there as a silent warning of what was happening in that place. The Burning Candle, 1943. One night in a basement, I saw a woman lighting a candle as bombs fell in the distance. "It's for my daughter," she said, holding up a picture. The flickering light seemed like a silent prayer amid the chaos.